The hospital room, despite being luxurious with its pastel-colored walls and state-of-the-art equipment, seemed suffocating that afternoon. The golden sunlight streamed in through the half-closed blinds, creating dancing patterns on the polished marble floor, contrasting with the heavy atmosphere that hung in the air. Lillian, at 35 years old, lay on the immaculate white sheets, her fragile body like porcelain about to shatter. Even consumed by the terminal illness that had advanced with frightening speed, she maintained a dignity and elegance that had always been her trademark. Her raven hair framing her pale face, her slender hands now clutching her son Everett's small hands with renewed strength. The 7-year-old boy, with his large brown eyes brimming with tears, remained by the bedside, unable to fully comprehend that these would be the last moments with his mother. "Mommy's not going away, is she?" "The doctor said you'll get better soon, that we can go home," Everett whispered, his voice choked with suppressed sobs, hugging his small stuffed bear tightly against his chest, as if that gesture could prevent his world from crumbling. Sterling observed the scene a few steps back, surreptitiously checking the gold watch on his wrist every few minutes. At 40 years old, Everett's stepfather exuded the appearance of a successful businessman. Impeccably tailored suit, perfectly combed hair, gleaming Italian shoes. However, his dark eyes revealed a calculated coldness that he tried to conceal beneath a forced semblance of concern. He moved restlessly around the room, adjusting the curtains, conversing in hushed tones with the nurse at the door, more interested in the bureaucratic unfolding of the situation than the human drama unfolding before him. The nurse exited quickly, casting a pitying glance towards little Everett, while Sterling returned to his position, crossing his arms impatiently. "Lillian, dear, perhaps we should let you rest a bit. Everett and I can come back later when you're feeling better," Sterling suggested with false sweetness, his voice betraying the underlying irritation at having to remain there for so long. Lillian completely ignored Sterling's suggestion, focusing all her remaining energy on her son. Her face, despite the pallor and deep circles under her eyes, lit up with a fragile smile when Everett drew closer. She knew her time was running out rapidly. The doctors had been clear. The fulminant illness that had stricken her did not respond to any treatment. With trembling hands, Lillian stroked the boy's raven hair, identical to her own, trying to memorize every detail of his childish face. The machines surrounding the bed emitted constant beeps, like a silent countdown that only she seemed to hear. With visible effort, she mustered her last strength to impart to her son the words she needed to say before parting. "My son, promise you'll be brave. Remember that I'll always be with you, even when you can't see me. Here," she lightly touched the boy's chest, "in your heart where no one can take me away." Tears finally escaped Everett's eyes, streaming down his rosy cheeks in silent rivulets. He tried to be strong as his mother had always taught him, but the pain was too great for his little heart to contain. Lillian, perceiving her son's suffering, removed from her neck a delicate golden locket she always carried. With trembling fingers she opened it, revealing a photograph of the two of them, smiling on a sunny day at the beach, a memory of happier times, before the illness, before Sterling entered their lives. The medallion shone under the sunlight as she placed it in her son's hands, gently closing his little fingers around the jewel with a soft but meaningful pressure. Everett looked at the gift with reverence, as if he instinctively understood the value of that final gesture. "I will keep it forever, Mom. I promise to be brave, even when I'm afraid." "It's like that story you used to tell me, about the little warrior who faced huge monsters with his pure heart," the boy replied, trying to smile through tears, tucking the medallion into his shirt pocket like the most precious treasure in the world. Lillian then made a feeble gesture to Sterling, beckoning him closer. Her face, once softened by maternal love, took on a serious and determined expression as her husband leaned over her. With one last look at Everett, she gently asked, "Son, can you ask the nurse for some water for me?" When the boy reluctantly left the room, Lillian gripped Sterling's wrist with a surprising strength for someone in her condition. Her eyes, once dulled by illness, now sparked with a fierce intensity as she pulled her husband closer, whispering with difficulty but firmly enough that he had no doubts about the seriousness of her words. "I know about your illegal businesses. My lawyer has everything documented. Take good care of my son or it will all come to light. Don't think I haven't taken precautions. Everett will not be helpless or at your mercy, she managed to articulate, each word seeming to drain what little energy she had left. Sterling's expression transformed for an instant, the veneer of concern vanishing completely, replaced by pure hatred that twisted his handsome features into a hideous mask. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he leaned even closer, almost nose to nose with Lillian. His strong hands gripped her arm discreetly, leaving red marks on her pale skin. He was about to respond when a violent convulsion shook Lillian's frail body, arching her on the bed as if an invisible electric current ran through her. The machines around her began emitting shrill, insistent alarms, filling the room with their ominous chorus. Sterling quickly recoiled, his face returning to a mask of concern as the door burst open, and a team of doctors and nurses rushed in, moving with the choreographed urgency of those accustomed to dealing with death. "Code Blue! Prepare the defibrillator now," the lead doctor shouted, his authoritative voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Everett returned at that moment, the glass of water forgotten in his trembling hands as he watched in horror the scene unfolding. He tried to run to his mother, calling out to her in heart-wrenching, desperate cries that tore at everyone in the room, everyone except Sterling, who quickly grabbed the boy by the shoulders, dragging him away from the bedside. Everett struggled fiercely against his stepfather's firm grip, his small fists pounding uselessly at the air as tears blurred his vision. The boy's screams mingled with the frantic beeping of the machines and the urgent orders of the doctors, creating a chaotic symphony of despair. Sterling held the boy firmly, his fingers digging unnecessarily hard into Everett's delicate shoulders as he watched the medical team's efforts with clinical disinterest. "Mom, let me go. Let me stay with her. Mom, don't leave." "You promised you'd stay with me. You promised," Everett cried out incessantly, his childlike voice rising in anguish as he stretched his arms towards Lillian as if he could reach her through sheer force of will. The doctors worked frenetically, applying electric shocks to Lillian's chest, injecting medications, performing cardiac compressions in rapid and precise motions. Sweat poured down the concentrated foreheads of the medical team as they battled against the inevitable. Minutes that seemed like hours ticked by in that silent battle against death, until gradually the professionals' movements began to slow. The lead doctor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes that had witnessed too many losses, checked the vital signs one last time before slowly stepping away from the bed. The silence that followed was more deafening than all the alarms and shouts combined, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck all hope out of the room. The doctor approached Sterling and Everett, his face a practiced professional mask of compassion. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, crouching down to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could. Your mother isn't suffering anymore," he said softly, the words falling like heavy stones on Everett's shattered heart. Everett felt his legs weaken, his knees slamming painfully against the cold floor as he crumpled, his small body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The locket pressed against his chest, as if burning his skin through the fabric of his shirt, the last tangible memory of his mother now weighing like lead. Sterling, seeing that all eyes were on the devastated boy, seized the opportunity to play the role of the loving, consoling stepfather. He knelt beside Everett, draping an arm around the boy's trembling shoulders, while his other hand stroked the black hair in a gesture that, to onlookers, appeared tender and comforting. Leaning closer, his face turned so no one else could see his expression or hear his words, Sterling whispered menacingly in Everett's ear, his low voice laced with barely veiled threat. "Now, it's just you and me. And if you say a word about what your mother told me, you'll deeply regret it. Remember that when you think about opening your little mouth to anyone." A week later, the cemetery was shrouded in a thin morning mist, lending the place an ethereal, disconnected quality perfectly aligned with the emotional numbness Everett felt. White flowers blanketed Lillian's elegant casket, their sweet scent mingling with the smell of damp earth and contained sorrow. Dozens of people dressed in black formed a circle around the open grave, friends, distant relatives, co-workers, all with appropriately solemn expressions, many more interested in the deceased's fortune than her legacy. Everett stood beside Sterling, small and lost in his tailored black suit, eyes red and swollen from crying, now dry and empty as if he had exhausted all the tears his little body could produce. The priest recited the final prayers, words of comfort that rang hollow and meaningless to the boy, clutching the locket tightly enough for its edges to painfully dig into his palm. Sterling kept a firm hand on Everett's shoulder, fingers tightening slightly whenever the boy shifted, a silent reminder of the threat still fresh in his ears. The family's elderly lawyer, a man with keen eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, approached with a sealed envelope. As requested by the deceased, the will must be read immediately after the funeral, he announced formally, his eyes scrutinizing Sterling's face with barely concealed suspicion as Sterling discreetly smiled upon receiving the document, his eyes shining with the satisfaction of a predator who has finally captured its prey. The Sinclair mansion, once a symbol of elegance and refinement under Lillian's command, had become an unrecognizable place after only 3 months of her death. Night fell over the imposing property, the shadows elongating through the corridors like ghostly fingers that seemed to want to reach little Everett. The golden light that once filled every corner of the mansion had given way to cold and insufficient lighting, casting unsettling shadows on the walls where Lillian's smiling portraits used to hang. Sterling had ordered that all photographs of his late wife be removed or hidden in forgotten corners of the house, as if trying to erase not only the physical memory, but the very essence of the woman who had once reigned there. The chambers that once reflected Lillian's warm and vibrant personality now displayed an austere and impersonal decor, with dark and heavy furniture that seemed to suck away any remaining joy. Everett stopped before an empty space on the wall, where his favorite portrait of his mother used to hang, the one where she smiled broadly in the garden, with flowers in her dark hair. "She used to tell me that houses have memories, that the walls hold the laughter and tears of those who lived within them," he murmured to himself, touching the lighter mark on the wall where the frame had been. Can she see me now, lost in our own home that no longer feels like ours? Everett moved through the corridors like a little ghost, avoiding making any noise that might attract unwanted attention. His light steps barely touched the polished marble floor as he dodged the employees and mainly Miriam, the new 60-year-old housekeeper hired by Sterling right after the funeral. With her graying hair always pulled back in a severe bun and small eyes that seemed to constantly scrutinize, Miriam strictly followed Sterling's instructions regarding the boy. Keep him clean and fed, but completely subjugated. The days of affection and attention were over for Everett. Now his meals were served at strict times, his baths timed, his activities meticulously controlled. On that particular night, the mansion was especially bustling, with staff running for the final preparations of an important dinner that Sterling would host for potential investors. Everett watched hidden behind a column as Miriam supervised the setting of the dining table, her cutting voice addressing a young maid who was placing the cutlery. Mr. Sinclair was very specific about how he wants this table. The napkins must be folded exactly this way. He does not tolerate imperfections. And remember that the boy must be presentable for dinner, no matter how much he resists. If he doesn't cooperate, there will be consequences, Miriam instructed coldly, obsessively adjusting the distance between the porcelain plates. That man is not my father, and he never will be. No matter how many times he tries to pretend he cares about me in front of strangers, thought Everett, feeling a knot of anguish form in his throat. As the night progressed, the guests began to arrive in their luxury cars, elegantly dressed men and women, with rehearsed smiles and evaluative glances that analyzed every detail of the mansion. Everett was forced to wear a navy blue suit that Lillian had bought for him before falling ill, a piece that now seemed too large for his body, thinned by months of emotional neglect. Miriam brushed his hair forcefully with unnecessary roughness, pulling it back with water and hairspray, transforming the boy into an uncomfortable miniature version of Sterling. She held him firmly by the shoulders, her fingers digging into his tender flesh as she threatened in a whisper before leading him to meet the guests in the great hall. Mr. Sinclair demands impeccable behavior tonight. You will smile, respond politely when spoken to, and cause no trouble. Otherwise, you will spend the weekend locked in your room without meals. Do you understand me well, boy? Her voice was low but carried unquestionable authority, making Everett swallow the acidic response he wanted to give. I understand, Mrs. Miriam. I will be the perfect boy everyone expects to see. "Even though I know this is all a big lie," he replied, his eyes fixed on the floor so she wouldn't see the contained rage in his gaze. The dinner unfolded in an atmosphere of false cordiality, with Sterling occupying the head of the table, the place that once belonged to Lillian, commanding the conversation with his calculated charisma. Crystals clinked, silver cutlery slid silently over fine porcelain, and artificial laughter filled the air laden with expensive perfumes and ambition. Everett was seated to Sterling's right, exactly where his stepfather could keep him under constant control. The guests, 5 couples of potential investors for Sterling's new ventures, occasionally cast poorly concealed looks of pity at the boy, clearly aware of the recent family tragedy. A middle-aged woman with excessive jewelry leaned toward Everett, her voice artificially sweet, while offering him a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You must miss your mother terribly, dear. What a blessing to have such a devoted stepfather to care for you in these difficult times," she commented, looking approvingly at Sterling, who immediately assumed his best devoted stepfather expression, placing a hand on Everett's shoulder in a gesture that seemed affectionate to the guest's eyes. "Everett is my priority now. Lillian left us too soon, but I promised her I would care for our beloved boy as if he were my own son. Isn't that right, Everett?" Sterling squeezed the boy's shoulder with seemingly affectionate force, but his fingers pinched the skin cruelly under the fabric of the suit, a clear message of what would happen if the answer was unsatisfactory. "Yes, Uncle Sterling has been very attentive," Everett replied mechanically, forcing a smile that hurt his face as he thought, if they knew what happens when there's no audience to applaud his perfect stepfather show. The conversation soon drifted to business, with Sterling enthusiastically detailing his plans to expand the chemical company he had inherited through his marriage to Lillian. Everett observed silently, catching fragments of information that his childish but perceptive brain tried to piece together into a coherent puzzle. Words like discrete operation, extraordinary profits and unconventional procedures were exchanged in lower tones, always followed by complicit smiles and knowing nods. One of the men, older and seemingly more cautious than the others, asked questions about environmental licenses and government oversight, to which Sterling responded with an excessive confidence that seemed to hide something sinister. "My contacts guarantee we won't have issues with unexpected inspections. Sinclair Chemicals operates under the highest standards, those that interest us, of course." The laughter that followed that statement sent a chill down Everett's spine, who was suddenly reminded of his mother's last words to Sterling. The boy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his mind working feverishly as he connected the dots. Sterling, noticing Everett's sudden interest in the conversation, quickly changed the subject, proposing a toast. "To new beginnings and lucrative partnerships. Hand to my darling stepson, who will one day inherit this entire empire," he declared, raising his crystal glass as his eyes met Everett's with a silent warning. "An empire built on lies and my mother's money. She knew what you were doing, that's why she tried to threaten you at the hospital," thought Everett, holding Sterling's gaze with a courage that surprised even himself. After dinner, as the guests withdrew to the lounge for drinks and cigars, Everett was dismissed with strict orders from Miriam to go straight to his room. However, as soon as the governess walked away to oversee the cleaning of the dining room, the boy saw his opportunity. With the ease of someone who knew every inch of that house, he silently slid through the corridors until he reached Sterling's office, a room that had once belonged to his mother and now remained constantly locked. Thanks to an old lock that Everett knew how to manipulate with a paperclip, a trick taught by an older cousin during a distant summer, the door gave way with a soft click. The office was shrouded in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the moonlight streaming in through the large French windows. Everett moved cautiously among the imposing furniture, making his way to the large mahogany desk where Sterling kept his most important documents. The drawers were locked, but a forgotten folder on the desk immediately caught his attention. The cover bore the Sinclair Chemicals logo and the inscription "Confidential" in red letters. With his heart racing and his fingers trembling, Everett opened the folder, his eyes widening as he discovered detailed documents about clandestine operations, along with photographs of a hidden laboratory that looked nothing like the legitimate facilities the company publicly maintained. One of the photos showed Sterling shaking hands with a man of suspicious appearance, in front of barrels marked with toxic material symbols. Another document listed chemical compounds with names Everett didn't understand, but which were followed by handwritten notes like "Do not declare" and "Divert to special production." The boy swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he held the evidence of what his mother had tried to expose. So this is what she discovered before she died. Sterling isn't just stealing her company, he's using it for something illegal and dangerous, he whispered to himself, feeling a mixture of horror and validation. I need to find the lawyer Mom mentioned, show him this proof before Sterling realizes. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Everett's blood run cold in his veins. Quickly, he tried to reorganize the documents in the folder, but in his haste some sheets slipped and fell to the floor. The office door burst open before he could pick them up, revealing Sterling standing on the threshold, his face a mask of fury as he caught sight of the boy hunched over his confidential papers. With 3 long strides, Sterling crossed the office and seized Everett by the arm with enough force to leave marks, yanking him away from the desk in a rough motion that nearly dislocated the boy's shoulder. Sterling's eyes, normally cold and calculating, now burned with an unchecked rage that twisted his handsome features into something monstrous. His breath, reeking of expensive whiskey and cigars, invaded Everett's nostrils as he violently shook the boy, his face inches from the child's. "What do you think you're doing? Snooping through my private documents?" Sterling's voice, though low to avoid attracting attention, vibrated with a contained fury more terrifying than if he had been shouting. His fingers dug into Everett's arm like iron talons, but instead of shrinking back as he had so many times in recent months, the boy felt a surge of courage rise within him, the same courage his mother had begged him to keep in her final moments. "You're hurting me. Let go now, or I'll scream so loud that all your guests will hear. They'd love to know what the respectable Mr. Sinclair does to a child when no one's watching." Sterling's eyes widened momentarily at Everett's unexpected audacity, but soon narrowed again in calculating slits. He loosened his grip slightly, but did not fully release the boy's arm. Instead, his lips curved into a cold smile as he examined Everett as if truly seeing him for the first time. No longer as a mere inconvenient heir who needed to be controlled, but as a potential threat that needed to be eliminated. Everett held his stepfather's gaze, his mother's locket weighing against his chest beneath his shirt, as a silent reminder of his promise to be brave. With his chin raised in defiance, the boy hurled the words he had been harboring for months, sharp stones meant to wound. "I know about your illegal businesses, the dangerous chemicals, the secret lab, everything. My mom left proof with the lawyer. She told me everything before she died, said you were stealing her company, doing illegal and dangerous things." The lie about his mother telling him flowed easily from his lips, mingling with the truths he had just uncovered in the documents. It was a desperate gambit, but Everett hoped it might scare Sterling enough to make him back off. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of concern crossed his stepfather's face, but it was quickly replaced by an expression of cruel amusement that chilled Everett's blood. Sterling let out a cold laugh that echoed off the office walls, a hollow sound devoid of humor, laden only with scorn and malice. Still gripping Everett's arm with one hand, he used the other to calmly gather the scattered documents, methodically organizing them back into the folder, as if he wasn't in the midst of a confrontation with a child. His movements were deliberately slow, designed to prolong the tension and fear. When he finished, he stared at Everett with a look of utter superiority, the confidence of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to run. "Proof? What proof?" "Your mysterious lawyer never showed up, did he? And you know why? Because he doesn't exist. Your mother was delirious in her final days, confused by the strong medications." Sterling brought his face close to Everett's again, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper that seemed more like a venomous caress. "And even if there were proof, who would believe you? A traumatized boy grieving his mother's death, spinning fantastical tales about the devoted stepfather who gave up his comfortable bachelor life to care for an ungrateful orphan. Do you know what happens to children who know too much, Everett? They end up in places where no one can hear them, places where their stories become mere screams into the void." Terror finally began to overcome Everett's courage as he saw the cold determination in Sterling's eyes. There was no hesitation there, no shred of humanity or compassion, only the calculating resolve of a man willing to do anything to protect his secrets and newly acquired fortune. Sterling began dragging Everett out of the study, his hand an unrelenting manacle around the boy's thin arm. Everett tried to resist, digging his heels into the thick carpet, but it was like fighting against a force of nature, relentless and overwhelming. They crossed the main hallway of the mansion, Sterling keeping an artificial smile on his lips in case they encountered any lingering guests, while whispering continuous threats into Everett's ear. The boy looked around desperately for help, but the few remaining servants purposefully averted their gaze, trained by Sterling to ignore any signs of trouble involving the young heir. Miriam briefly appeared at the end of the hallway, her eyes meeting Everett's for a fleeting second, before she deliberately turned her back and disappeared, another adult choosing not to see what was happening under the roof of Sinclair Manor. Sterling led Everett through increasingly dimly lit and unused corridors of the mansion, areas the boy himself barely recognized, despite having grown up in that house. Finally, they reached an old section of the building where the smell of mold and abandonment permeated the air. Did you really think you could defy me? Me who built an empire from nothing, while idiots like your mother were born in a golden cradle without ever having to fight for anything. It's time for you to learn your place in this house, Everett, Sterling hissed, stopping in front of a solid wooden door that Everett had never noticed before. With a fluid motion, he took an old rusty key from his pocket and inserted it into the lock, which yielded with a sinister creak. Do you know what's behind this door, boy? The place where disobedient children learn to keep quiet. The door opened to reveal a narrow, steep spiral staircase descending into darkness. Everett instinctively tried to back away, but Sterling shoved him forward with brutal force, nearly causing him to tumble down the steps. The stepfather turned on an old switch on the wall, dimly illuminating the path with flickering yellow bulbs that cast dancing shadows on the damp stone walls. The basement of Sinclair Manor was a place forgotten by time, a remnant of the era when the property was built, centuries ago. Sterling pushed Everett down the stairs, holding him firmly enough to prevent the boy from falling and getting hurt, not out of compassion, but to ensure he arrived conscious at his destination. The air grew colder and damper as they descended, laden with the smells of damp earth and abandonment. When they finally reached the bottom, Everett felt his heart stop for an instant at the sight of what awaited him. In a corner of the basement, illuminated by a single hanging lamp, stood a metal cage. Not a hasty improvisation, but a solidly constructed structure with thick bars and a sturdy lock. The size was precisely calculated to accommodate a child, neither too large to offer comfort, nor too small to be obviously cruel to the casual observer's eyes. Even more disturbing was what was inside the cage, a battered stuffed bear that Everett immediately recognized as identical to his own favorite toy, a gift from his mother that he still kept in his room. The sight of the toy, strategically placed in the center of the cage, sent a wave of terror down Everett's spine, for it symbolized the horrible premeditation of that act. Sterling had not prepared this in a fit of anger. He had carefully planned this moment, anticipating that he would eventually need to silence the boy. "Welcome to your new home, Everett," Sterling declared with sinister satisfaction, dragging the paralyzed boy toward the cage. "Here you'll have all the time in the world to think about the consequences of prying into the affairs of adults. And who knows, if you learn your lesson quickly enough, maybe I'll let you out, eventually." Everett felt his entire body freeze in horror, his feet suddenly seeming made of lead, as Sterling dragged him inexorably toward the cage. The reality of the situation finally hit him with full force. This man, this monster who had married his mother, had no limits to his cruelty. The tears Everett had fought to hold back for months finally overflowed, running freely down his face, as he began to struggle desperately, kicking and thrashing with the frenzied energy of sheer terror. His screams echoed against the stone walls of the basement, but he knew with devastating clarity that no one would come to help him. The thick walls of the old mansion would ensure that his despair remained contained in that underground space, just as he himself would soon be. Sterling, irritated by the sudden resistance, applied more force, twisting Everett's arm at a painful angle that elicited a sharp cry from the boy. With a brutal motion, he opened the cage door and shoved Everett inside with such violence that the boy fell to his knees on the cold, damp concrete floor. Before Everett could recover, the metal door slammed shut with a final clang, followed by the definitive click of the lock being secured. Sterling observed his handiwork for a moment, a satisfied smile twisting his elegant features as he held the cage key between his fingers like a trophy. Crouching down to be at eye level with Everett, he spoke with a false sweetness that was more terrifying than any shout. "Do you know what the best part is, Everett? No one is going to miss you. To the outside world, you're at an exclusive boarding school in Switzerland. That's what I told everyone. I even have forged letters in your handwriting to show the curious. How long do you think it will take for people to stop asking about you? 6 months? A year? Eventually, everyone moves on. Everyone forgets." Days passed, though for Everett, time had lost any meaning in the damp darkness of the Sinclair mansion's basement. His small 7-year-old body was visibly wasted away, his shoulders hunched by the invisible weight of despair, his once vibrant face now pallid and marked by deep shadows under the eyes. The cage, with its cold and merciless metal bars, barely allowed him to fully stretch out to sleep. The thin, dirty mattress on the floor offered little comfort against the cold concrete, and the threadbare blanket could barely fend off the chill that seemed to emanate from the very stone walls. Everett hugged the stuffed bear that Sterling had placed there as a cruel mockery. The toy, despite representing the stepfather's premeditated malice, had become his only solace during the endless hours of solitude. Sitting with his back against the bars, he traced imaginary patterns in the dust on the floor, trying to maintain his sanity through simple games invented to pass the time. His mother's locket remained hidden under his soiled shirt, the only real connection to the world that existed before this nightmare. "Mom said I needed to be brave, but I don't know if I can anymore," he whispered to the stuffed bear, silent tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "How can I fight against a monster that everyone thinks is a hero?" The familiar creak of the basement door made Everett quickly raise his head, his body tense with the Pavlovian fear that now associated any sound. He instinctively shrank back into the farthest corner of the cage, pulling his knees to his chest in a defensive posture his body automatically adopted. To his relief, it wasn't Sterling descending the creaking steps, but Miriam, carrying a tray with what would be his only meal of the day. The housekeeper moved cautiously through the basement, her eyes constantly turning toward the stairs, as if fearful of being caught at any moment. As she approached the cage, Everett could see the meager meal. A stale bread, a bowl of watery soup, and a glass of water. It was little, but still more than Sterling had ordered. From the first day of his captivity, Everett had sensed a hesitation in Miriam, a reluctance in her eyes when following Sterling's cruel orders. The elderly woman arrived at the cage, bending down with difficulty to push the tray through the small bottom opening between the bars. Her face, normally a mask of professional severity, now betrayed a repressed compassion when her eyes met Everett's. "Mr. Sinclair has left for a business meeting," she informed him in a low voice, adjusting the napkin over the bread in an apparently casual manner. "He shouldn't be back until evening. Eat everything, boy. You need to keep your strength up. Who knows when another chance will come." Everett approached the tray cautiously, still distrustful after days of mistreatment. It was then that he noticed something strange. The napkin seemed to cover something bulkier than just bread. With trembling hands, he gently pulled it back, revealing a small old cell phone hidden under the cloth. His eyes widened in shock and hope, quickly turning back to Miriam in a silent question. The housekeeper threw another nervous glance toward the stairs, before leaning even closer to the bars, her face now inches from Everett's. The woman's eyes, which had once seemed hard and indifferent, now overflowed with a mixture of fear and determination. With deliberate movements, she pushed the cell phone closer to Everett's hands through the bars, making sure it was within his reach. "Be careful, boy. Use it only when it's safe," she whispered urgently, her wrinkled fingers briefly touching the child's in an almost maternal gesture. "Sterling has terrible plans for you. I overheard him talking on the phone about sending you away, to a place where no one would ever find you. I can no longer pretend not to see what's happening in this house." Upstairs in the mansion, the atmosphere was completely different. Natural light flooded the main hall through the enormous stained glass windows that Lillian had so loved. The contrast between the two worlds that now coexisted within the same structure could not be more glaring. Camille Hawthorne, at 32 years old, crossed the grand entrance hall with the natural elegance that had always characterized her. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her black hair styled in a sophisticated bun, and heels echoing authoritatively against the polished marble, Camille carried not only the beauty that had always drawn attention, but also the fierce determination that had made her one of the most respected lawyers in the city. As Lillian's best friend for over 2 decades, she knew every corner of that mansion, every tradition of the Sinclair family, and, more importantly, she had known Everett since his birth, having been chosen as his godmother. Sterling greeted her with a rehearsed smile that did not reach his cold eyes, leading her to the living room with an excessive cordiality that sounded false to Camille's trained ears. "What a pleasant surprise, Camille. If I had known about your visit, I would have prepared something special, but please make yourself comfortable. What do I owe the pleasure?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit while signaling for a servant to bring drinks. "I did not come for a social visit, Sterling. I am concerned about Everett. I've been trying to speak with him for weeks, and all my messages are met with vague excuses about study schedules and time zone differences. As his godmother, I demand to know what is happening." Sterling maintained his perfectly controlled composure in the face of Camille's direct questioning, only a slight stiffening of his shoulders betraying his discomfort. With deliberately slow movements, he poured himself an expensive whiskey, offering Camille a glass of wine, which she refused with an impatient gesture. The man took a small sip of his drink before responding, using those seconds to carefully craft his lie. "Everett is at an excellent boarding school in Switzerland. After Lillian's death, he was inconsolable, and the psychologists recommended a complete change of environment. The school has an excellent program for children who have suffered trauma, with intensive psychological counseling," Sterling explained with feigned concern, each word flowing smoothly and rehearsed. "I have been receiving weekly reports on his progress, and believe me, it was the most difficult decision I've ever made, but necessary for his well-being." Camille listened attentively, her keen eyes studying every micro-expression on Sterling's face. Something about the explanation felt profoundly wrong, triggering all her instincts as both a lawyer and someone who intimately knew the family. Strange, Lillian never mentioned plans to send him abroad. In fact, she was vehemently against the idea of boarding schools. Everett has always been educated by private tutors here at the mansion, following the Sinclair family tradition. Why change that now, precisely when he needs stability and familiar figures around him the most? Camille's incisive question hit Sterling like a physical blow, visibly unsettling him for a moment before he managed to regain his mask of control. A muscle twitched in his tense jaw as he forcefully set the whiskey glass down on the table, with slightly excessive force, causing the amber liquid to subtly splash. With a forced laugh, he stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to Camille as he tried to fully regain his composure. "Circumstances have changed drastically, Camille. Lillian is no longer here to make those decisions, and as Everett's legal guardian, I must do what I consider best for him. The doctors were adamant about the need for a fresh start." He turned around again, now with the perfect smile in place, his calculating eyes assessing Camille's reaction. "I can show you the letters he has been sending. He's adapting well, making new friends. Of course he misses home, but the intensive therapy is helping him process the grief." Camille remained seated, outwardly impassive, but her mind was working frenetically, analyzing every word, every gesture, every inconsistency in Sterling's story. "I would very much like to see those letters, and also the enrollment documents, school contact information, and when I can visit him." As Lillian's designated godmother and the attorney appointed in her will to oversee matters related to Everett, I have not only the right, but the legal duty to verify his well-being. Sterling opened his mouth to respond, when Camille, with the casual motion of someone adjusting their position for greater comfort, knocked over her purse. Its contents spilled onto the polished floor, and she quickly bent down to gather the items. It was at this moment that her eyes caught something partially hidden under a nearby armchair, a piece of colored paper that she immediately recognized as a drawing. With fluid motions that would not raise suspicion, Camille collected the drawing along with her belongings, but not before noting the recent date scribbled in the corner, just 3 days prior. The drawing, unmistakably done by Everett's hand, showed a small figure behind what appeared to be bars, with a larger, menacing figure on the outside. Camille's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral as she discreetly tucked the paper into her purse. Sterling stepped closer to assist her, his overly solicitous manner contrasting with the evident tension in his movements. "Let me fetch those letters for you. They're in my office," he offered, clearly anxious to usher Camille out of the room. She nodded with an equally false smile, mentally noting the way his eyes avoided direct contact, a clear, telltale sign of lying that she had identified in countless interrogations throughout her legal career. "Of course I'll be waiting. And I'd also like to see Everett's room if possible. I brought some gifts I promised him before Lillian's funeral. I want to properly package them to send to Switzerland." The seemingly innocent request made Sterling hesitate momentarily before nodding, his smile frozen as he quickly exited the room. Back in the basement, Everett stared at the small cell phone as if it were a rope thrown to a drowning man. With hands shaking uncontrollably, he hid it under the thin blanket as soon as Miriam went upstairs, promising to return later to collect the tray. The boy forced himself to eat the meager meal, knowing he would need strength for what he planned to do. Every bite of the bland soup and stale bread was an effort, his stomach clenched after days of inadequate nourishment, but he persisted, determined not to waste the opportunity Miriam had risked so much to provide him. Time dragged like molasses as he waited, alert for any sound coming from the basement door. Finally, when the silence became deep enough that he could hear his own pounding heart, Everett retrieved the cell phone from its hiding place. The device was old and simple, but to the boy it represented his only chance of salvation. With fingers clumsy from anxiety, he turned on the phone, the glow of the screen illuminating his pale face in the dim basement. The battery showed only 2 bars. There would be no time for mistakes or hesitation. Everett quickly thought of who could help him. His first idea was Camille, his godmother, but he couldn't remember her number by heart. Then the memory of safety lessons at school came to his mind, the universal emergency number his teacher had insisted everyone memorize. "I need to be fast and clear. Say my name, where I am, and that I'm in danger. I only have one chance to get this right," he murmured to himself, gathering courage as he dialed the numbers with trembling fingers. "If I fail now, Sterling will find out, and then all will be lost forever." The phone rang, each ring echoing like thunder in Everett's hypersensitive ears. He pressed the device against his ear with such force that it hurt, as if he could physically push his voice through the telephone line by sheer force of will. After 3 interminable rings, a female voice answered on the other end. Professional, calm, trained for crises. "Central Station, how can I help you?" Everett felt a knot form in his throat, the emotion nearly choking his words. Forcing himself to speak, he began to convey his desperate message, the words pouring out in an urgent, broken stream. "Please help me. My name is Everett Sinclair. I'm trapped in a cage in the basement of Sinclair Manor. My stepfather, Sterling Sinclair, locked me up here after I discovered his illegal business dealings. He killed my mother, Lillian Sinclair, and now he wants to get rid of me, too." Tears streamed freely down the boy's face as he poured out his story, his voice wavering between barely contained sobs. The policewoman on the other end of the line seemed momentarily stunned by the urgency and content of the call, but quickly regained her training. "Everett, I'm listening to you. Stay calm and tell me exactly where you are. What is the address of the manor?" Everett opened his mouth to answer, preparing to provide the details that could save him, when the sound he most feared in the world froze his blood in his veins, the heavy basement door opening with a slow, agonizing creak. Everett's heart nearly stopped when he recognized Sterling's heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. They weren't the hurried, light steps of Miriam, but rather the confident, menacing gait he had learned to fear over the past few weeks. With a frantic motion, he quickly whispered into the phone, "Sinclair Manor on Palm Avenue, please help me," before hanging up and trying to hide the device under the thin mattress. But his hands, trembling with panic, betrayed him. The phone slipped, hitting the concrete floor with an audible thud. Everett lunged for it, desperately trying to hide it, but it was too late. Sterling had reached the bottom of the stairs, and the unmistakable sound of metal striking concrete echoed through the basement like a death sentence. The footsteps, already deliberately slow as if Sterling wanted to prolong the terror of his approach, stopped completely for a second. Then they resumed at a quicker, more determined pace, advancing relentlessly toward the cage. The dim basement light cast Sterling's elongated shadow against the damp wall, a distorted, monstrous silhouette that seemed to grow with every step he took toward Everett. The boy shrank back against the bars at the rear of the cage, the phone now clutched tightly in his hand behind his back, completely exposed, and with no real hope of hiding it. Sterling finally emerged from the gloom, his face a mask of controlled fury, more terrifying than any outburst of unbridled rage. His cold eyes instantly fixed on the object in Everett's hands, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips as he approached the cage inexorably. "It seems we have a very clever little rat here," he said, his voice low and menacing as he reached for the cage key in his pocket. "I think it's time to show you what happens to rats who try to call the cat." At Central Precinct, Detective Naomi Prescott hung up the phone with a grave expression. The fragments of information she had just received were enough to trigger all the internal alarms she had developed over 20 years of service. The call had been abruptly cut off, but the words "Sinclair Mansion" and "Help me" echoed in her mind with disturbing clarity. At 45 years old, with her determined posture and piercing eyes that missed no details, Prescott was known for her unwavering dedication to cases involving endangered children. She rose from her chair in a swift motion, grabbing her coat hanging on the rack while gesturing to her assistant, Officer Logan, who was already standing, attentive to her orders. The office around them buzzed with the typical activity of a busy precinct, but Prescott remained focused, her mind quickly processing the possibilities and the necessary next steps. It was a child's voice, no doubt, desperate, terrified. They mentioned the Sinclair Mansion and asked for help before the call was abruptly cut off. This wasn't an accidental disconnection. Someone interrupted that call, she declared, opening a drawer to retrieve her service weapon and badge. "We don't know exactly what's happening there, but when a child calls the police in that state, it's our duty to investigate immediately." Logan, a promising young officer in the force, was already checking information about the Sinclair Mansion in the police system. His nimble fingers typed commands into the computer as Prescott prepared to leave. The screen illuminated the officer's concentrated face as relevant data quickly appeared. Sinclair Mansion, located on Palm Avenue, number 38, current property of Sterling Sinclair, businessman in the chemical sector. Recent widower of Lillian Sinclair, deceased about 3 months ago due to complications from a terminal illness, he reported, his eyes quickly scanning the additional information. They have a son, Everett Sinclair, 7 years old. No previous incident records at the address. Prescott silently absorbed the information, her brow furrowing slightly as she adjusted the holster on her hip. Something about the situation triggered her deepest instincts, those that rarely misled her. The contrast between Sterling Sinclair's impeccable public image and the palpable desperation in the child's voice on the phone created a dissonance she couldn't ignore. Sterling Sinclair is a well-known figure in high society, isn't he? The kind of businessman who appears in social columns and makes generous charitable donations, she commented, not really expecting a response. I've seen this facade many times before. The most dangerous monsters are often those no one suspects. In the basement of Sinclair Mansion, the heavy air of moisture and fear became almost unbreathable. Sterling, with the now shattered cell phone at his feet, gripped the bars of the cage with such force that his knuckles whitened. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now burned with a fury that transformed his elegant face into an unrecognizable mask. Everett had retreated to the farthest corner of the cage, his small body trembling uncontrollably as he watched his stepfather. The adrenaline from the failed attempt to call for help now drained from his system, leaving him exhausted and even more vulnerable. Sterling took several deep breaths, visibly struggling to regain control of his emotions. It was this ability to quickly recompose himself that made him truly threatening. Not his outbursts of anger, but the calculated coldness that followed them. When he finally spoke, his voice came out low and controlled, each word pronounced with disturbing clarity. "Who gave you that? It was that meddling old woman, wasn't it? Miriam always had a weakness for children. A pathetic sentimentality that will now cost her dearly." He stepped back from the bars, running a hand through his perfectly groomed hair in an automatic gesture to recompose his appearance. "And as for you, my little problem." This desperate attempt has only accelerated the inevitable. Sterling began walking slowly around the cage, like a predator circling its cornered prey. Each deliberate step echoed on the basement's concrete floor, amplifying the tension that hung in the damp air. Everett followed his stepfather's movements with wide eyes, his body still pressed against the corner of the cage, as if he could merge with the bars and disappear. A solitary tear rolled down his soiled face, but his chin remained raised in a last vestige of courage. That same courage his mother had begged him to maintain. Sterling suddenly stopped, leaning in to stare at the boy through the bars, his face a composition of contempt and barely contained irritation. "You really thought you could defeat me? Me, who built an empire from nothing? Who turned that mediocre company into an industrial powerhouse? Who conquered respect in the circles where power truly matters?" His voice rose gradually as he spoke, wounded vanity seeping through every syllable. He slammed against the cage bars forcefully, making Everett flinch. "Tomorrow you'll be sent away where nobody will ever find you. It's all arranged. People who know how to deal with troublesome, mouthy kids like you." Back at the precinct, Prescott worked with the methodical efficiency that characterized her. After gathering the preliminary information, she needed to decide on the most appropriate approach for the situation. Cases involving prominent figures like Sterling Sinclair required strategic caution, not out of deference to his social standing, but to ensure any actions taken would be legally unassailable. She glanced at the wall clock for a moment, mentally calculating the time needed to obtain a formal search warrant versus the potential risk to the child who had made the call. Logan, sensing her momentary hesitation, approached with an additional file he had just printed. "I found something interesting, Delegate. Lillian Sinclair was the original owner of the chemical company. Sterling was just an administrative employee when they married 2 years ago. After her death, he took complete control of the business and the family's significant fortune," he reported, pointing to the relevant documents. "And there's more. Her son, Everett Sinclair, was supposedly enrolled in a Swiss boarding school 3 weeks after the funeral. However, I couldn't find any records of an active passport or airline ticket in the boy's name for the past 3 months." Prescott took the documents, her eyes quickly scanning the information as the pieces began to fall into place in her mind. "An anonymous report of possible child abuse is enough reason for a welfare check visit, without the need for a prior warrant," she concluded, handing the folder back to Logan. "Prepare a patrol car. We're going to pay a surprise visit to that mansion." As Prescott and Logan prepared to leave, Sterling Sinclair hurried up the stairs from the basement of the mansion. After locking the door with the key he always kept in the inner pocket of his jacket, he checked the deserted hallway to ensure no one had witnessed his exit from the basement. Satisfied with the privacy, he took a cell phone from his pocket and dialed a number that wasn't registered in his contacts, a contact that existed only in his memory for security reasons. As he waited for an answer, he automatically adjusted his silk tie and checked his reflection in an ornate mirror hanging in the hallway, like an actor checking his character before going on stage. When the call was answered, his voice took on an unquestionable tone of authority. "There has been a complication. We need to move up the schedule. The boy managed to make contact with someone. I don't know if it was the police or someone else, but we can't take any risks," he explained in a low voice, moving down the hallway towards the kitchen, where he knew he would find Miriam at that hour. "Yes, still tonight. I have everything prepared in the office, the documents, the agreed money. No one suspects yet, but we need to act quickly." He paused, listening to the response on the other end of the line, his face gradually hardening. "The price is not a problem. The boy will be delivered tomorrow before dawn. Make sure no one ever finds him. I want him so far away from here that not even an international search would be able to track him down." Sterling ended the call as he approached the kitchen, smoothly putting the phone in his pocket before pushing the door unnecessarily hard. Miriam had her back to the entrance, methodically organizing the clean dishes on the high shelves, her slow movements revealing her advanced age and the accumulated weariness of decades of domestic work. At the sound of the slamming door, she turned around startled, a delicate cup trembling in her wrinkled hands. The immediate recognition of the expression on Sterling's face made her visibly pale. She had worked long enough for wealthy families to recognize the signs of imminent danger. Sterling strode across the kitchen in long strides, his presence dominating the environment like a contained storm. Without any preamble, he grabbed Miriam's arm, making the cup fall and shatter on the immaculate floor. His fingers dug into the frail flesh of the old woman's arm, with enough force to leave marks, but not enough for her to make any sound beyond a sudden intake of contained pain. He pulled her closer, leaning in so that his face was inches from hers. "You gave the boy a phone, didn't you?" he hissed, his low voice more threatening than any shout could be. Miriam's eyes, normally submissive after years of servitude, held his gaze with a surprising firmness that contained as much fear as determination. "What you're doing to that boy is inhumane. Mrs. Lillian trusted you to care for her son, not to keep him like an animal." Sterling let out a short, humorless laugh, not loosening his grip on Miriam's arm. His eyes roved over the governess's wrinkled face, as if assessing the value of an object he considered discarding. "Your touching loyalty to Lillian's memory will cost you dearly, old fool. Do you think I don't notice how you look at me with judgment? How you whisper prayers when you pass the basement door?" He released her with a rough shove that made her stagger against the kitchen counter. "You're fired. You have 15 minutes to gather your belongings and leave my property." Miriam massaged her aching arm, but her face maintained a calm dignity that contrasted with Sterling's contained fury. She straightened slowly, adjusting the governess uniform she had worn for so many years in that house. "You won't get rid of what you've done so easily, Mr. Sinclair. That boy is loved by many people, people who will miss him. People who won't believe the convenient story you've concocted." Sterling narrowed his eyes dangerously at the unexpected challenge. "Leave my house now before I decide I need more definitive measures to ensure your silence," he threatened, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "And remember, no one would believe the ravings of a disgruntled servant against one of the most respected men in this city." Minutes later, Sterling watched from the top of the main staircase as Miriam crossed the foyer with a small battered suitcase, her aged body upright with a dignity he secretly envied. The governess paused momentarily at the door, glancing one last time at the mansion that had been her workplace for over 2 decades. Her gaze briefly crossed Sterling's before she stepped out into the night, leaving the door open behind her in a final act of small rebellion. Sterling hurried down the stairs to close the door, irritated by the old woman's insignificant gesture. As he turned the handle, he noticed the lights of an approaching vehicle through the open gates of the property. His heart raced when he identified the car as an unmarked but unmistakable police cruiser, for anyone familiar with the models used by law enforcement. For a fleeting moment, he considered not answering, claiming he was asleep or indisposed. But his calculating mind quickly dismissed that option. Refusing to attend to the police would only raise more suspicions. With the swiftness that characterized him in crisis situations, Sterling composed his expression into a mask of polite concern, adjusted his tie, and prepared for the imminent confrontation. The cruiser pulled up in front of the main entrance, and he could distinguish 2 figures emerging from the vehicle: a middle-aged woman with an unmistakable authoritative demeanor and a younger man who clearly followed her lead. Sterling took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing the answers he would give to the questions that would inevitably come. "Whatever that kid said on the phone, it's his word against mine," he thought, forcing a cordial smile as the officers approached. And who would believe the fantasies of a troubled child over an upstanding citizen like me? The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Everett's room, illuminating the perfectly made bed that no one had slept in for weeks. Sterling moved through the room with the cold precision of a surgeon, methodically selecting the boy's clothes from the closet and folding them into an open travel bag on the bed. His gestures were calculated and efficient, devoid of any trace of the emotion that would normally accompany a child's departure preparations. He took Everett's school uniform that he never got to wear, some casual outfits and undergarments, organizing everything with meticulous attention to detail, not out of paternal care, but from an obsessive need to maintain appearances. Lastly, Sterling picked up the worn teddy bear resting on the pillow, a gift Lillian had given their son on his last birthday before falling ill. For a moment, his fingers clutched the toy with unnecessary force, as if trying to extract from it any remnant of the affection between mother and son. Miriam stopped at the bedroom door, her wrinkled hands gripping her apron tightly as she watched the scene with growing horror. Despite the threat of dismissal the night before, Sterling had kept her in the house. A calculated risk, since a disappearing governess at the same time as the boy could raise unwanted suspicions. "You can't simply make him disappear like you did with all of Lillian's portraits," she said, her voice trembling with restrained indignation. "People will look for him, ask questions. Children don't vanish without leaving traces." Sterling merely smiled coldly without interrupting his task, placing the teddy bear atop the folded clothes with an almost theatrical care. The mansion was silent that morning, most of the staff dismissed by Sterling under the pretext of giving them a day off, in truth, to eliminate witnesses to what he planned to do. With a fluid motion, he closed the suitcase and locked it, tucking the small key into the pocket of his vest. His eyes met Miriam's with a threatening glint that made her instinctively recoil. The man adjusted the cuffs of his impeccably pressed shirt as he walked toward the governess, stopping just a few inches from her, a calculated proximity to intimidate. The official story is that Everett has been transferred to a special program in Switzerland that doesn't allow contact during the adjustment period. In 6 months, maybe a year, I'll send letters written by him, mentioning how happy and adapted he is. Eventually, I'll announce that he decided to stay abroad permanently for his studies. A sad story but plausible about a boy traumatized by his mother's death. Sterling adjusted his tie with a studied motion, his face a mask of calm that contrasted with the cruelty of his words. "And as for you, your position in this house depends solely on your ability to keep that mouth shut. Believe me, Miriam, no one will give credence to the words of a servant against a man of my social standing." The shrill ringing of the doorbell cut through the tension between them like a sharp blade. Sterling froze momentarily, his body tense like a startled predatory animal. He hadn't expected visitors that morning. He had carefully avoided any social engagements to ensure his plan unfolded without interference. Miriam took advantage of the distraction to move away, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs as she tried to process a way to help Everett. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Sterling grabbed the suitcase with one hand and Miriam's arm with the other, his fingers digging into the frail flesh of the elderly woman. "Answer the door. Whoever it is, tell them I'm indisposed or busy with an important call. Do not let them in under any circumstances," he ordered, his low voice laden with implicit threat. "If you say a word about the boy, if you make any insinuation, I swear you will regret it until the last day of your miserable existence." Miriam nodded mechanically, years of servile obedience momentarily overriding the impulse of resistance that had been growing within her. "One day, Mr. Sterling, you will have to answer for your actions. If not before the justice of men, certainly before the one that no one escapes." Miriam hurried down the stairs, while Sterling secured the suitcase in the office adjacent to Everett's room. The governess took a deep breath to compose herself before opening the front door, surprised to find 2 women who could not be more different from each other, united only by the determination evident in their postures. Delegate Prescott, in her discreet professional suit and unyielding demeanor, contrasted with Camille's sophisticated elegance, impeccably dressed in a tailored ensemble that betrayed her privileged social standing. Miriam immediately recognized Lillian's best friend, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Before she could follow Sterling's instructions, Camille had already advanced with the familiarity of someone who knew that house as well as her own quarters. "Good morning, Miriam. I did not expect to announce myself in the house I have been frequenting since before Everett's birth," she said with a warm but determined smile, already crossing the threshold. The delegate followed with the natural authority of her position, discreetly showing her badge to Miriam. "Delegate Naomi Prescott, we need to speak with Mr. Sinclair about an urgent matter." Miriam hesitated for only a second, her gaze alternating between the 2 women before making her decision. "The gentleman is at home, yes. Please wait in the main parlor while I inform him of your visit. Would you like some coffee?" Sterling appeared at the top of the staircase before Miriam could walk away, his initial surprise already carefully masked by a cordial smile that didn't reach his eyes. He descended the steps with the studied confidence of an experienced actor entering the stage, every movement calculated to project the image of the devoted widower and exemplary stepfather. His gaze quickly assessed the visitors, lingering a bit longer on the deputy, whose presence he clearly did not expect. "Camille, what a pleasant surprise. And I see you've brought company. To what do I owe the pleasure of this early morning visit?" Sterling extended his hand to greet the two women, his friendly tone contrasting with the underlying tension Miriam could sense in his posture. The housekeeper remained discreetly in the background, closely observing the interaction, while her mind worked frenetically, torn between fear of Sterling's threats and the urgency to help Everett. Deputy Prescott briefly shook the offered hand, her trained eyes assessing every micro-expression on the host's face. "We received a suspicious call from this address yesterday. As part of standard procedure, we're checking to see if everything is all right." Camille stepped forward before Sterling could respond, her social smile not completely concealing the determination in her eyes. "And I came to pick up some of Lillian's belongings that I promised to charity. You know how devoted she was to social causes," she explained, removing her gloves with elegant movements while her eyes scanned the surroundings, noting the subtle changes in decor, the empty spaces where Lillian's photographs once hung. "And I would very much like to see Everett. I've been trying to reach him for weeks without success. As his godmother, I feel I'm failing the promise I made to Lillian to always be present in his life." Sterling kept his smile fixed, although a tense muscle in his jaw momentarily betrayed his irritation. He gestured invitingly towards the main hall, taking control of the situation with the skill of an experienced manipulator. "Please make yourselves comfortable. Miriam, bring coffee for our guests," he ordered, his friendly voice carrying a note of command that did not escape the delegate's attention. "As for Everett, as I explained earlier, Camille, he is adapting well to the new school environment. The boarding school in Switzerland has strict rules about communication during the initial adjustment period." Leading the visitors through the main hall, Sterling offered an improvised tour of the mansion, clearly trying to control the flow of the visit. He showed them the recently renovated library, the gardens visible through the large windows, always maintaining a fluid conversation on superficial topics. Delegate Prescott, however, was not easily distracted. Her trained eyes registered every detail of the environment, every closed door, every unshown corridor. During the tour, she noticed how Sterling subtly steered the group away from certain areas of the mansion, particularly avoiding a side corridor that seemed to lead to an older section of the property. At a strategic moment, when Sterling was distracted answering a deliberately complex question from Camille about the Sinclair family paintings, Prescott stepped away a few steps, examining the avoided corridor. Her experienced eyes immediately noticed scratch marks on the paint of a sturdy door at the end of the corridor. Recent marks that contrasted with the impeccable maintenance of the rest of the mansion. When Sterling realized her detachment, he quickly approached with a tense smile. "Interested in historical architecture, delegate? This wing contains some of the original structures of the mansion," he casually commented, trying to guide her back to the group. Prescott stood firm, discreetly pointing at the door. "What's down there, Mr. Sinclair? Those marks look quite recent." The direct question made Sterling hesitate for a fraction of a second, long enough for Prescott to register the flash of concern in his eyes before he recomposed his mask of cordiality. He gave a light, studied, careless laugh as he positioned himself strategically between the delegate and the door, as if he were merely adjusting his stance for the conversation. Camille drew closer, her curiosity now genuinely piqued by the palpable tension between the two. Sterling stuffed his hands in his pockets in an apparently casual gesture, but one Prescott recognized as defensive. "Just an old wine cellar, nothing interesting. The mansion is nearly 200 years old, delegate. Damp, dark basements come with the package," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It was sealed off years ago due to structural issues. My architect advised against using it until it's properly restored. These old houses are a constant maintenance job, as you can imagine." Down in the basement, 3 floors below that seemingly civilized exchange, Everett huddled in his cage, exhausted and dehydrated. Since the incident with the phone, Sterling hadn't allowed Miriam to bring him food or water, a calculated punishment to weaken him before the planned transfer. The oppressive silence of the basement was suddenly broken by muffled sounds from the floor above. Voices, footsteps, the telltale creak of the old floorboards at certain points in the mansion Everett knew so well. The boy lifted his head, his senses sharpened by isolation picking up on the subtle acoustic changes. A desperate hope flared in his chest as he recognized, amid the indistinct noises, the familiar timbre of a female voice he hadn't heard in months. "Camille!" The realization hit him like an electric shock, sending a wave of adrenaline through his weakened body. With a renewed energy fueled by desperation, Everett gripped the bars of the cage and began to scream with all the force his lungs would allow, his hoarse voice tearing through the basement's silence. "Help! I'm down here! Camille, somebody help me!" His frantic cries echoed off the stone walls, but he knew the thick walls and solid floor of the old mansion would significantly muffle the sound before it reached the upper floors. Upstairs, Miriam had retreated to the kitchen after serving coffee, ostensibly to fetch cookies, but truly to process the whirlwind of emotions and decisions confronting her. The unexpected presence of the delegate and Camille represented an opportunity that might not come again. For weeks she had been a silent accomplice to Everett's suffering, unable to directly confront Sterling out of fear, but equally unable to completely ignore the abuses she witnessed. Her attempt to help with the phone had failed and only worsened the boy's situation. Now, however, fate had placed a silver platter loaded with the fine porcelain Lillian so prized in her kitchen. The housekeeper looked at her gnarled hands, marked by decades of obedient service, and made her decision. Gripping the tray firmly, she deliberately walked back to the parlor where Sterling continued his well-rehearsed performance for the visitors. As she passed the corridor leading to the basement, Miriam slowed her pace, tilting her head subtly to listen more intently. The muffled sound of Everett's desperate cries reached her ears, inaudible to anyone not specifically attuned, but clear as a bell to her who knew exactly what to listen for. With renewed determination, the housekeeper entered the parlor at the precise moment Sterling was leading the visitors away from the forbidden hallway. "The cookies, Mrs. Lillian always served on special occasions," Miriam announced in a voice louder than necessary, positioning herself strategically between Sterling and the guests. Then, in a movement that would seem accidental to any casual observer, she tilted the tray at a precise angle, sending cups, teapot, and silverware crashing to the floor with a deafening clatter. The sudden crash created the perfect moment of chaos and distraction. Sterling whirled abruptly toward the source of the noise, his aristocratic composure momentarily shattered by a look of fury directed at the housekeeper. Prescott, with the honed reflexes of years on the police force, seized the opportunity to take a few steps toward the mysterious door, alert for any sound that might confirm his growing suspicions. Camille, in turn, was already moving to help Miriam, but froze abruptly mid-stride. Her whole body tensed, her head tilted slightly, her eyes widening in recognition and horror. In the brief silence that followed the initial crash, in the interval between the shattering of porcelain and Miriam's elaborate apologies, a faint but unmistakable sound reached Camille's ears, the desperate voice of her godson calling for help. To anyone else, it might have been merely the old house creaking or the wind in the ventilation ducts, but for Camille, who had known Everett's voice since his first babbles, there was no doubt. Her eyes met Sterling's at the exact moment he realized what she had heard. The blood drained from her face, while his expression hardened into a mask of calculated coldness. For an eternal second, they stared at each other in silent acknowledgement of the revealed truth, the air between them charged with the electricity of an inevitable confrontation. "Everett isn't in Switzerland, is he?" Camille whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and dawning fury. "What did you do to him, Sterling? What did you do to my godson?" The parlor of Sinclair Manor transformed into a silent battlefield. Sterling positioned himself strategically between the women and the corridor leading to the basement, his artificial smile masking growing panic. Camille stood firm, her eyes fixed on his, while Delegate Prescott watched every move intently. Miriam, still crouched near the shattered porcelain, seized the distraction to act. Her wrinkled hands moved deliberately into the pocket of her apron, from which she withdrew a bundle of ancient keys. With a calculated motion that seemed accidental, she dropped them precisely at Camille's feet. "Pardon me, ma'am. My age no longer allows me to be so agile." she murmured submissively, but her gaze conveyed a clear message. "The bronze key with the ornate head is the one for the basement. The boy needs you." Camille reacted instantly, bending down in a fluid motion to snatch up the keys before Sterling could intercept her. In a second, she was running down the corridor toward the forbidden door, with Sterling and Prescott close behind. The ancient hallways of the manor, once silent, now echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps and frantic breathing. Camille reached the door first, her hands trembling as she struggled to fit the key into the rusted lock. Sterling arrived moments later, his face contorted with fury, trying to wrench the keys from her grasp. "You're making a terrible mistake," he snarled, his fingers gripping her wrist with enough force to bruise. "There is no child down there, only the feverish imagination of a senile governess." Prescott intervened swiftly, shoving Sterling away from Camille with professional force. "Step back, Mr. Sinclair. Obstructing justice is a crime." The heavy door finally opened with a groan of neglected hinges, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. Camille didn't hesitate, going down the steps 2 at a time, guided only by the faint yellowish light coming from the bottom. Prescott followed close behind, one hand on the railing and the other on his gun, keeping Sterling in his line of sight as he reluctantly descended after them. The air grew thicker and damper with each step, laden with the smell of mold and abandonment. When they finally reached the bottom of the stairs, Camille froze, her entire body rigid with shock. In the farthest corner of the basement, dimly lit by the single hanging lamp, was a metal cage, and inside it, huddled against the bars, Everett watched her with wide eyes of hope and disbelief. Everett. The name escaped Camille's lips like a prayer, as she ran towards the cage, falling to her knees before the bars. "I'm here now. We're going to get you out of there." Everett could barely believe what his eyes were seeing. After weeks in captivity, the familiar face of his godmother appeared like a miracle in his endless nightmare. His small hands gripped the bars with renewed strength, tears of relief flowing freely down his hollow cheeks. He was noticeably thinner, with deep, dark circles under his eyes, and the look of someone who had aged years in just a few months. Still, a fragile smile lit up his face when Camille touched his hands through the bars. His eyes caught movement behind her, Sterling standing at the base of the stairs, watching the scene with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing its options. The boy's initial fear transformed into something more potent, the courage born of outrage. "Aunt Camille, he killed my mom, I saw everything." The accusation burst from him with the force of a long-repressed truth. He was switching her medicine every night. It wasn't the same stuff the doctor prescribed. Everett's revelation hung in the musty basement air, like a judgment. Camille gasped, her mind rapidly processing the implications. Lillian's sudden illness, her inexplicably swift deterioration. Sterling stepped forward, his voice taking on a tone of forced concern. "He's delirious." His mother's death deeply affected him. His words rang hollow, rehearsed, as he gestured in increasing desperation. Traumatized children often create fantasies to explain losses they cannot process. "Please, be reasonable." Prescott showed no sign of doubt as she advanced towards him, handcuffs already in one hand while the other kept her gun steady. "Sterling Sinclair, you are under arrest for the charges of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and child abuse. You have the right to remain silent." What happened next unfolded in seconds. Sterling, perceiving the imminent loss of everything, fortune, freedom, reputation, reacted with the desperate violence of a cornered animal. In a sudden motion, he lunged at Prescott, using his weight as an advantage. The deputy, caught off guard by the frontal attack, stumbled backward, her head painfully colliding with the stone wall. The impact momentarily disoriented her, long enough for Sterling to wrench the gun from her grasp. Miriam, who had silently descended after the others, let out a muffled cry of alarm. Camille immediately stood up, positioning herself between the cage and Sterling, her body a determined barrier between the danger and Everett. "Sterling, stop! You're only making your situation worse." Her words fell on deaf ears. Sterling backed toward the stairs, the gun alternately aimed at each of them, his wild eyes contrasting with the calculated precision of his movements. Prescott was trying to recover, pressing her forehead where a cut stung fiercely. Camille dared not move from the front of the cage, as Miriam helped the injured delegate to her feet. The heavy silence was broken by Sterling's icy voice. "No one will believe you." The word of a disturbed child, a disgruntled employee, an emotionally involved friend. He shook his head with a cruel smile, starting to ascend the stairs backward, always keeping the gun trained on the group. "My lawyers will build a solid case of defamation against all of you. Everett will continue to receive special treatment for his trauma, and everything will return to normal." Sterling reached the top of the stairs, his dark silhouette cut against the light from the hallway. With a quick motion, he exited through the door, slamming it shut with a boom that echoed through the basement like a final sentence. The metallic sound of the key turning in the lock made it clear. They were trapped. Camille ran to the stairs, climbing the steps only to confirm the obvious, while Prescott examined the lock with professional eyes. "It's old but solid. Without proper tools, we won't be able to force it." Sterling's muffled voice penetrated the heavy door, each word laden with the terrible calm of a decision already made. "I'm going to take care of this once and for all. When I return, none of you will be alive to tell this story." Sterling's footsteps faded away, leaving the group in oppressive silence. Camille hurried back to the cage, examining the lock while trying to remain calm for Everett's sake. "We'll get you out of there, dear, I promise." Her hands trembled as she tried various keys from the ring. Prescott, regaining her professional composure despite the wound, was swiftly organizing a plan. "He'll be back soon, probably with something to eliminate any evidence, us included." Miriam approached the cage, her ancient eyes laden with determination. "There's a secret passage in this basement, built during Prohibition for smuggling. Lillian showed me once." The housekeeper's words ignited a spark of hope in the darkness. "We need to find it before Sterling returns. We don't have much time." Sterling's footsteps had barely faded when Prescott took charge of the situation, years of police training replacing her initial shock with decisive action. Despite the blood still trickling from her forehead, she approached the cage where Everett remained trapped, examining the lock with experienced eyes. Camille kept the boy's hands between hers through the bars, whispering words of comfort as she watched the deputy work. Miriam quickly scanned the basement, searching for any object that could serve as a tool. Prescott retrieved a hairpin, bending it at a specific angle before inserting it into the antique lock. "In emergency situations, basic techniques can work on simple locks like this," she explained, manipulating the metal with precision as she gently turned it. "Everett, hang in there just a little longer. We're going to get you out and find a way out." After tense minutes that seemed like hours, the lock finally yielded with a satisfying click. Camille flung the cage door open in a rush, kneeling to gather Everett into her arms. The boy flung himself forward, clinging to his godmother as if fearing she might vanish at any moment. His little body trembled with the impact of emotions too intense for his age: relief, fear, hope. Prescott watched the scene momentarily, before turning his attention back to the locked door at the top of the stairs. Miriam approached the group, her wrinkled face etched with a determination surprising for someone of her age and station. "The main door is not our only exit. This mansion is much older than any of us and holds many secrets," she revealed, looking meaningfully at one of the back walls of the basement. "I've worked my whole life for the Sinclair family. I know things no one else knows." Miriam led the group to the south wall of the basement, where dusty shelves supported forgotten wine bottles and ancient crates. With movements surprisingly agile for her age, she began pushing the shelves aside, revealing a section of the wall that, to unprepared eyes, seemed identical to the rest. During Prohibition, the Sinclair family managed a lucrative trade in smuggled liquor. This passage connects the basement to a tunnel leading to the riverbanks, 300 meters from the property, she explained, her fingers trailing along the seemingly solid bricks until pressing one in particular. To everyone's astonishment, the wall slid sideways a few inches, revealing a dark opening just wide enough for one person at a time. Prescott examined the passage cautiously, testing the stability of the walls. "We'll need light. This tunnel doesn't seem to have been used in decades, and we don't know its condition." Camille, still protectively embracing Everett, noticed something glinting against the boy's chest, the medallion Lillian had given him before dying, still hanging around his neck after all those weeks of captivity. As Prescott improvised torches using old rags and alcohol found among the basement's cleaning supplies, Camille gently touched the locket. "You kept this all this time," she commented in a choked voice, carefully opening the jewel to reveal Lillian's smiling photograph. That's when she noticed something unusual, a small protrusion on the back of the picture. Carefully, she removed the image, discovering a mini memory card hidden in a secret compartment of the locket. Her eyes widened in instant understanding. Lillian was always clever. She knew she might need to protect you two. Miriam drew closer, observing the discovery with a sad, knowing smile. The housekeeper seemed to age and grow younger simultaneously, the weight of secrets kept for so long finally being lifted. She touched the memory card reverentially, as if it were a sacred relic. The lady always said the truth was her only protection. In the weeks before she fell ill, she spent hours locked in the study, investigating the company's records. She was worried, nervous. The housekeeper looked directly at Everett, her ancient eyes laden with belated understanding. She uncovered something in Sterling's business dealings, something terrible. That's when she suddenly began to fall ill. Prescott returned with the improvised torches, distributing them among the adults while summarizing the situation. This evidence could be crucial, but our priority now is to get out of here safely. Everett first, then Camille. Miriam, you know the way, so go right after them. I'll cover the rear. She checked her watch, mentally calculating how long it might take Sterling to return. As if answering her thoughts, ominous sounds came from upstairs. Heavy footsteps and the distinct noise of liquid being spilled. Everett gripped Camille's hand tightly, his face paling with renewed fear. "He's coming back. He's pouring something. It smells like the fuel he used for the boat." Prescott gestured urgently towards the passage, his voice low but firm. "He plans to set the basement on fire. We need to leave now." Camille entered the passage first, helping Everett follow her. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to move single file, hunched over to avoid the uneven ceiling carved from raw earth and rock. Miriam came right after, her familiarity with the passage guiding them through the darkness, where the faint torchlight barely illuminated a few meters ahead. Prescott brought up the rear, constantly looking back to ensure they weren't being followed. The air in the tunnel was damp and heavy, laden with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood that supported some of the more unstable sections. Everett stumbled over an exposed root, nearly falling. Camille held him firmly, but in the sudden movement, the chain of the medallion, already weakened by weeks of continuous wear, broke. The jewel silently fell to the earthen floor of the tunnel, imperceptible in the gloom as the group hurried onwards. "Watch your step, Everett. We're almost there. Soon we'll be away from this horrible mansion." Above them, Sterling returned to the basement carrying gasoline cans. His plan was simple but effective. A fire in the basement, easily explainable as an accident involving the mansion's old electrical system. No evidence, no witnesses. The truth would die along with his prisoners. As he descended the stairs, prepared to find the terrified group, Sterling froze in shock. The cage was empty, the basement deserted. "Impossible!" he roared, dropping the cans and rushing to examine every corner of the large space. It was then that he saw the partially opened wall, revealing the secret passage he didn't even know existed. On the ground near the tunnel entrance, something shone under the dim light, Everett's locket. Sterling picked it up, instantly recognizing the jewel that Lillian always wore. With nimble fingers, he opened the locket, finding not only the photograph but also the secret compartment behind it. Now empty. The realization of what that meant hit him like a bolt of lightning. His face contorted into a mask of fury as he hurled one of the jerry cans against the wall. "You won't get away!" he shouted into the dark tunnel, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he ran into the passage, determined to catch them before it was too late. Night had fully fallen over Sinclair Manor when the group emerged from the tunnel through a concealed exit amid dense shrubbery in the estate's gardens. The fresh air filled their lungs like a blessing after the stifling atmosphere of the underground passage. They had barely time to get their bearings when an orange glow illuminated the windows on the ground floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering in extreme heat. Sterling had set the basement on fire as planned, apparently unconcerned that the flames could consume the entire manor. Miriam gasped to see the place that had been her home for decades, beginning to be devoured by the flames, her wrinkled face contorting in a mixture of horror and sadness. Prescott quickly took charge, guiding the group toward the rear entrance. They needed to retrieve the memory card and ensure Sterling didn't escape. The fire will spread rapidly through such an old structure. The dry wood of the floors and walls is perfect fuel, she warned, her emergency training evident in her steady voice. We have minutes, not hours, to get in and out. If we split up, everyone head for the main gate, understood? As they entered through the kitchen, the contrast between the mansion's earlier tranquility and the current chaos was shocking. The air, once perfumed with expensive essences, was now thick with smoke descending in heavy waves from the ceiling. The lights flickered intermittently, creating a disturbing strobe effect that transformed familiar corridors into alien passages. Everett clung tightly to Camille's hand, his small fingers trembling not only with fear, but also with nascent rage at seeing the place where he had grown up being destroyed by Sterling's greed. The group advanced in tight formation, Prescott at the front, followed by Camille and Everett, with Miriam bringing up the rear. Each step took them deeper into the burning mansion, the heat perceptibly increasing as they neared the center of the property. It was when they turned a corner that they saw him, Sterling, his face contorted in wild fury, blocking the passage leading to the grand main hall. His eyes reflected the flames consuming the mansion, giving him a demonic appearance as he advanced towards them. "You won't destroy everything I've built. The boy is mine. The fortune is mine," he shouted, his voice rising above the crackle of the flames now licking the ornate ceiling above them. The group instinctively recoiled, turning to seek another path. The mansion, which Everett knew like the back of his hand, had transformed into a treacherous labyrinth where every decision could mean life or death. Camille pulled the boy into a side corridor, closely followed by Prescott and Miriam. The walls were beginning to ominously creak with the intense heat, the paint bubbling and peeling like skin burned by the sun. Miriam, despite her advanced age, moved with an agility born of desperation, her mind rapidly cataloguing possible escape routes as they ran. The smoke was becoming thicker by the moment, forcing them to crouch low to find breathable air near the floor. The heavy tread of Sterling's footsteps echoed behind them, mingling with the rising roar of flames that seemed to take on a life of their own, devouring everything in their path with insatiable hunger. As they rounded another corner, they encountered a dead end. The corridor ahead was completely blocked by fallen ceiling beams, engulfed in flames that made passage impossible. Miriam pulled them into a side door leading to a set of interconnected rooms. "This way, the back exit." "There's a service passage the employees used, less ornate but sturdier than the main corridors," she shouted, her voice hoarse from smoke as she guided the group through rooms increasingly invaded by fire. The sequence of rooms led them on a winding path through the burning mansion. The old music room where Everett took piano lessons, the winter parlor where Lillian used to read to him on cold nights, the library with shelves now serving as fuel for the ravenous fire. Each room they passed through was a memory of their former life being incinerated before their eyes. The group finally emerged into a wide corridor leading directly to the back of the property. Hope flickered momentarily on their weary, soot-stained faces. A mere few meters away, a door leading to the gardens and freedom. It was at that precise moment that Sterling appeared from a side passage, like a predator who had anticipated his prey's movements. On his face, a mask of cruel determination that left no doubt about his intentions. Before anyone could react, he lunged straight for Everett, seizing the boy's arm with brutal force, wrenching him away from Camille with a violent motion. "You're coming with me. Without you, I don't get your mother's inheritance," he snarled, his fingers digging into the boy's slender arm as Everett cried out in pain. "It's all over, don't you understand? This house, these pieces of evidence, it will all be ashes in minutes. But with the boy, I still have a chance. A missing heir can conveniently reappear when it's safe." What happened next even surprised Camille. Something within her, that primal protective force that transcends fear and reason, exploded like a sudden storm. She lunged at Sterling with a violence she didn't know she possessed, her nails digging into his face as the full weight of her body pushed him away from Everett. "Take your hands off him, you monster," she screamed, her voice unrecognizable even to herself, transformed by hatred and determination to protect her godson at any cost. Sterling stumbled backward, momentarily stunned by the ferocity of the attack, releasing Everett, who immediately ran to Miriam. Seizing the distraction, Prescott advanced with the precision of years of police training, trying to immobilize Sterling with a professional arm lock. For a few seconds, it seemed she would be able to contain him, but Sterling, fueled by the desperation of a man watching his empire crumble, used his physical advantage to break free from the deputy. With a forceful shove, he pushed Prescott against a nearby table and escaped through a side door, momentarily disappearing from sight. The deputy recovered quickly, her professional instinct overriding the pain of the impact. "Head outside." "I'm going after him," she ordered, drawing a small backup gun from her ankle before giving chase. "We can't let him get away with everything he's done." Camille hesitated only a second before grabbing Everett's hand and running toward the nearest exit, following Miriam, who knew every inch of the property. The path ahead seemed clear, but when they reached the grand main hall, the heart of the mansion where the Sinclair family once entertained high society at glamorous parties, a terrifying sight greeted them. The fire had spread through the ventilation system, transforming the elegant hall into an inferno. Flames danced over the antique furniture, consumed the silk curtains, and licked at the ornate ceiling adorned with classical paintings that now melted like wax under the intense heat. Crossing the hall was the most direct route to safety, but every step represented a terrible risk. Still, there was no alternative. The side paths were already completely blocked by fire. Camille squeezed Everett's hand, her eyes meeting his in a silent question. The boy nodded bravely, a small but decisive motion that spoke volumes about the inner strength he had developed during his captivity. They both took a deep breath before launching themselves into the hellish crossing, closely followed by Miriam. "Stay low. The air is more breathable near the ground," Camille shouted, pulling Everett down as they ran between flaming furniture and falling ceiling debris raining down around them. "Don't look back, just keep running." They were nearly halfway across the hall when disaster struck. With a deafening crack that overpowered even the roar of the flames, a massive ceiling beam gave way, bringing with it a shower of flaming wood, plaster, and debris. The fiery barrier fell precisely between Camille and Everett on one side, and Miriam on the other, completely cutting off the path. Within seconds, what had been a perilous passage transformed into an impassable divide. Miriam found herself isolated, the intense heat preventing any attempt to reunite with the others. Her face, visible through the curtain of flames, contorted in despair and resignation. Camille screamed for her to find another way out, but the roar of the fire swallowed the words, making communication almost impossible. With a heavy heart, Camille realized she had to keep going. Staying would condemn Everett along with her. The tension of that forced moment of separation was written in everyone's eyes, an unspoken farewell hanging in the superheated air between them. "Everett, is there another way out?" Camille asked desperately, looking around at the room quickly turning into a deadly trap, the heat becoming almost unbearable as the flames advanced relentlessly across the walls. "We need to get out now, or we'll never make it." It was at this critical moment that Everett displayed a surprising calm, as if something inside him had awakened, that same resilience that had allowed Lillian to face adversity with unwavering grace. His eyes scanned the flaming room, ignoring the chaos to focus on structural elements he knew intimately, after years of exploring every nook and cranny of the mansion. When his gaze fell upon a large portrait of his mother, miraculously still intact on a wall partially shielded from the fire, a memory crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. "Mom showed me once. She said it was our special secret," he revealed, pulling Camille toward the portrait that showed Lillian in her prime, elegant and serene in a sky-blue dress. The life-size painting seemed out of place amid the surrounding destruction, as if Lillian herself were protecting that last refuge for her son. Behind the painting, there's a passage that leads straight to the gardens. The family used it during the Civil War to hide when they needed to. With nimble fingers that belied his size, Everett pressed an almost imperceptible mechanism on the ornate frame. To Camille's horror, the portrait silently slid aside, revealing a narrow but passable opening leading into darkness, a promise of safety amidst the hell the mansion had become. A gust of fresh air from the tunnel confirmed it led outside. Camille pushed Everett toward the entrance, ready to follow him immediately. It was at that precise moment that a figure emerged from the flames behind them, like a demon materialized from the fire itself. Sterling, his face partially burned and his eyes injected with a fury beyond sanity, advanced with the determination of a predator in its final desperate act. Before Camille could fully react, he lunged forward, ignoring the flames licking at his own clothes, and brutally grabbed her by the ankle. "Nobody leaves. If I die here, you all die with me," he snarled, pulling her back as she struggled to maintain her footing at the tunnel's entrance. Everett was already inside, watching in horror as his godmother was dragged back into the inferno. Realizing she wouldn't be able to free herself without being completely pulled into the flames, Camille made the only choice possible. Pushing Everett deeper into the passage out of Sterling's reach, she looked directly into her godson's eyes with fierce determination. "Run, Everett, run!" she screamed, her fingers losing contact with his, as Sterling pulled her into the flames with relentless force. The narrow tunnel seemed endless as Everett advanced blindly, his small hands sliding along the damp walls to guide himself in the near-complete darkness. Each step took him further from Camille's screams, still echoing in his ears, each meter heightening the weight of guilt for leaving her behind. But he pressed on, driven by her final words. "Run, Everett." An order that carried with it the sacrifice of those who loved him. The passage finally ended at a small door camouflaged by dense ivy, hidden among the well-tended bushes of the backyard garden. Everett pushed it open with his shoulder, feeling the cool night air caress his soot-covered face as he finally emerged into freedom. The contrast was surreal, just meters behind him. Hell consumed the mansion that had been his home. Ahead, the immaculate gardens remained serene under the silvery moonlight, as if they belonged to another world. Turning, Everett gazed in horror at the magnitude of the destruction. The Sinclair mansion, imposing just hours ago, now burned in flames that reached the night sky, illuminating the property with an ominous orange glow. "Mom, help me save Aunt Camille," he whispered to the starry sky, his eyes reflecting the fire devouring the last material vestige of his childhood. "I can't lose anyone else I love." The survival instinct, honed by weeks of captivity, prevented Everett from running back to the burning mansion. Instead, he silently drifted away, keeping to the shadows as he skirted the garden toward the forest that bordered the property. Every movement was calculated, each step carefully placed to avoid dry branches that could betray his presence. The forest offered protection, a place to figure out how to get help without falling back into Sterling's clutches. The boy moved with surprising agility for someone so young, his determination overcoming the physical and emotional exhaustion weighing on his small shoulders. Moonlight filtered through the treetops, creating a silver path he instinctively followed, moving farther and farther from the burning mansion, but never taking his eyes off it. Sirens began to wail in the distance, rapidly approaching. Someone had seen the fire and alerted the firefighters. A spark of hope ignited in Everett's chest. "They'll save them, won't they? They have to make it in time to get Aunt Camille and the others out of there," he murmured to himself, his voice hoarse from inhaled smoke and restrained emotion. "Please hurry, please." Focused on the distant mansion and the ever-nearing sirens, Everett failed to notice the presence of others at the forest's edge until he collided directly with someone. The impact sent him sprawling on the leaf-strewn ground, the air escaping his lungs in a startled gasp. When he looked up, braced to flee again, his heart nearly stopped upon recognizing the moonlit face. Harrison Monroe, his mother's trusted lawyer, a man who had visited their home countless times before Lillian's illness. In his 60s, with his impeccable suit even at this late hour and naturally solemn expression, Monroe was the last person Everett expected to find there. He was not alone. Several police officers accompanied him, flashlights in hand, methodically searching the area with coordinated movements. The lawyer immediately knelt down, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the boy's condition. Torn clothes, face smeared with soot, clear signs of physical deprivation. "Everett, thank God. Camille called me earlier, saying she had found out where you were. I came as fast as I could," he exclaimed, his usual professional composure momentarily broken by the emotion of finding the boy alive. "We've been looking for you for weeks, Ever since I first got wind that something was off with the boarding school story. Everett desperately clung to the lawyer's arms, his small hands gripping the fine fabric of the suit with a force born of panic. Words poured out of him in a frantic torrent, each syllable charged with the urgency of someone who knows every second is precious. He pointed to the burning mansion, his words punctuated by gasping breaths as he tried to convey the gravity of the situation. "Aunt Camille and the others are inside. Sterling got her. She pushed me into the secret tunnel, but he grabbed her. You have to help her, please." His eyes, wide and glistening with unshed tears, pleaded for immediate action. "Miriam and the sheriff are also there. Sterling has a gun. He wanted to kill us. He wanted to burn everything down to hide what he did to me." The lawyer firmly gripped Everett's shoulders, his expression turning to one of determination as he took in the information. He made a quick gesture to the surrounding officers, who immediately activated their radios, transmitting urgent orders that triggered a wave of activity around the property. More sirens pierced the night as additional police cars and fire trucks converged on the main entrance of Sinclair Manor. Red and blue flashing lights illuminated the scene like a macabre spectacle, reflecting off the shattered windows from the extreme heat. Everett watched the frantic activity, his small body shaking not only from the cool night air after so long in the damp basement, but from the almost unbearable tension of waiting. Monroe had placed his own coat over the boy's shoulders and now held him in a firm embrace, providing a physical anchor to keep him from running back into the burning mansion as he clearly wanted to do. Firefighters in full gear rushed to the building, establishing hose lines and coordinating efforts to control the blaze that now consumed the entire main floor. Police established a perimeter, keeping onlookers at bay as they began to gather, drawn by the devastating spectacle. Everett followed every movement with watchful eyes, searching for any sign that the rescue efforts had found Camille. "They have special equipment to breathe in the smoke, don't they? And clothes that protect them from the fire?" he asked the lawyer, his small voice almost inaudible beneath the roar of the flames and the cacophony of sirens. "They'll be able to save Aunt Camille, they have to." Minutes turned into an eternity as Everett waited, his body tense as a violin string about to snap. A paramedic tried to examine him, but he refused to move away from the line of sight of the mansion, fearing that the moment he looked away would be precisely when Camille appeared. His right hand found the medallion he still carried with him, not the original lost in the escape, but a replacement Camille had given him weeks after the funeral, a perfect replica she had commissioned as a safeguard. His fingers traced the outline of the jewel repeatedly, a self-comforting gesture that had become almost a talisman during his captivity. Suddenly, his lips began to move silently, reciting words that Lillian had whispered in his ear so many times when fear gripped him. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something is more important than fear, he repeated like a mantra, his eyes never leaving the main entrance of the mansion. The lawyer leaned in to hear better, surprised. "Your mother taught you the words of Ambrose Redmoon. She always had refined taste for philosophy," he commented gently, squeezing the boy's shoulder in solidarity. "Lillian would be proud of the courage you displayed today." Time seemed suspended, each second stretching beyond the bounds of normal perception. Suddenly, movement at the main entrance captured everyone's attention. Figures were slowly emerging from the thick smoke, indistinct silhouettes that gradually gained form and substance. Firefighters carrying people, 3 people. Everett held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. The first firefighter carried Miriam, the elderly housekeeper looking even smaller and frailer in the burly man's arms. The second brought Delegate Prescott, whose determined bearing remained evident even as she was assisted out of the burning building. And then finally the third firefighter emerged carrying Camille. Her face was partially obscured by an oxygen mask. Her normally perfect hair was singed at the ends. Her elegant clothes were torn and stained with soot. But what mattered, the only detail Everett registered fully, was that her eyes were open, frantically searching the gathered crowd. The cry of joy that escaped the boy's throat was almost animal in its intensity, a pure sound of relief and renewed hope that cut through the surrounding chaos like a sure arrow. "Aunt Camille!" The paramedics tried to restrain Everett when he lurched forward, but they quickly gave up in the face of the fierce determination on his small face. He ran as he had never run before, his feet barely touching the ground as he crossed the distance separating him from Camille. She saw him immediately, her entire body reacting to the sound of his voice. Ignoring the paramedics' protests, Camille ripped off her oxygen mask and extended her arms, her face transforming with a smile that shone through the soot and tears. Everett threw himself into that embrace like a castaway reaching shore after weeks adrift, his small body colliding with hers with enough force to nearly knock her over. His arms wrapped around Camille's neck with desperate strength, as if fearing she might disappear if he loosened his grip. Tears streamed freely down both their faces, tears of relief, of pain, of renewed hope, of all the pent-up emotions finally finding release. "I thought I'd lost you too," Everett sobbed against her shoulder, his words almost unintelligible amid the overflowing emotions. "Sterling pulled you into the flames. I wanted to go back, wanted to help, but you told me to run." Camille cradled Everett's face in her hands, her eyes tracing every inch of his features as if to memorize every detail, to reassure herself that he was really there, alive, and relatively unharmed. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed dirty strands of hair from his forehead, a gesture so filled with tenderness that it seemed almost sacred amid the surrounding chaos. The burns on her own arms, the deep gash on her temple, the smoke that still clawed at her lungs, all of it seemed irrelevant now that Everett was safe in her arms. She hugged him tightly against her chest again, repeatedly kissing the top of his head, while gently rocking back and forth, an instinctively comforting motion. "We'll never be separated again, I promise," she whispered in a voice hoarse from inhaled smoke, but firm in her determination. "I managed to break free when part of the ceiling collapsed between us. Sterling was trapped on the other side and the firefighters found me before the smoke." She didn't complete the sentence, preferring to focus on the present, on the tangible miracle of the living boy in her arms. Monroe approached the reunited pair, respecting the moment but aware that practical matters needed to be resolved. In his hands, a leather portfolio that had survived the tumultuous events of the night intact, containing documents that now assumed crucial importance. As paramedics finally managed to convince Camille to accept medical treatment, the lawyer positioned himself beside the makeshift stretcher, never interrupting the eye contact between godmother and godson. Everett firmly held Camille's hand, even as the professionals treated her burns and checked her vital signs. With the discreet efficiency that characterized him, Monroe withdrew several documents from the portfolio, briefly showing them to Camille. Lillian had everything prepared. She replaced the false will that Sterling presented. "Camille, you are now Everett's legal guardian and administrator of the fund that will secure his future," he explained, his professional voice softened by genuine satisfaction. "The inconsistencies I found in the documents presented by Sterling alerted me from the beginning. Lillian had sought me out weeks before she fell ill, suspecting his activities. She left specific instructions regarding Everett's upbringing, should anything happen to her." Miriam approached slowly, supported by a paramedic. The elderly governess seemed to have aged decades in the last few hours, but her eyes shone with a peace that had long been absent. She extended a trembling hand to caress Everett's hair, a maternal gesture that spoke of decades watching the boy grow up, of silent love expressed in small daily acts of care. The boy smiled at her, recognizing in the simple touch everything Miriam had risked to help him. "Your mother can rest in peace now, Niño," she said softly, her voice carrying the slight accent she had never lost even after decades away from her homeland. She knew Sterling wasn't the man he pretended to be. She was gathering evidence against him. "I watched so many times as she worked late into the night in her office, documenting irregularities in the companies, photographing documents when he wasn't around." A solitary tear ran down the governess's wrinkled face, carrying with it the weight of secrets kept for too long. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have helped when I realized he was tampering with her medication. Forgive me for not being braver." A deafening explosion interrupted the moment, instinctively making everyone turn towards the mansion. The east wing, where the main bedrooms were located, collapsed completely in a shower of sparks and flaming debris. The century-old structure groaned like a wounded giant as it succumbed to the structural damage caused by the intense fire. Delegate Prescott, now with an improvised bandage on her forehead, approached the group, her professional gaze assessing the scene of destruction. We managed to recover some documents from the office before the fire consumed it completely. Enough evidence of Sinclair Chemicals' illegal operations to initiate a federal investigation, she reported, her voice maintaining professional firmness despite the traumatic events. The search teams have scoured all accessible areas of the mansion. We have not found Sterling yet. His words hung in the air like an unspoken threat, the possibility that the danger had not fully ended. Everett instinctively squeezed Camille's hand, fear momentarily returning to his eyes. He may have escaped through one of the secret passages. The mansion is full of them. My mother showed me several. It was at that precise moment, as if summoned by the boy's words, that the impossible happened. Against the backdrop of the apocalyptic destruction of the burning mansion, a figure emerged from the ruins of the main entrance. Staggering, clad in tattered, smoldering rags, the silhouette was almost unrecognizable as human, more akin to a mythological creature born of fire itself. Only the posture, that characteristic arrogance even in the face of total defeat, identified Sterling Sinclair. His face was disfigured by severe burns, hair charred, skin bubbling in places. But his eyes, those eyes that had always reflected calculating coldness, now burned with pure hatred, fixed directly on Everett and Camille. In his right hand, he brandished a flaming piece of wood torn from the debris, wielded as a primitive weapon. Police officers immediately drew their guns, shouting orders for him to stop, to surrender. Sterling ignored them completely, each stumbling step bringing him closer to the group gathered around the ambulance. His mind seemed to have crossed the threshold of sanity, reduced to a single primal impulse, vengeance against those who had destroyed his carefully constructed empire. You took everything. From me, his voice raspy from smoke and distorted by pain, still carried the terrible promise that he would not depart alone into the shadows. We will all burn together. Time froze in the gardens of Sinclair Manor as Sterling lurched forward through the flames, his body partially burned, yet moving with the irrational determination of someone who has nothing left to lose. Police officers formed a protective barrier, guns aimed, orders being shouted that he simply ignored. The problem, Sterling moved erratically between paramedics and civilians, making any shot extremely risky. His eyes, two embers of hatred in a face disfigured by fire, fixed solely on Everett and Camille. The flaming piece of wood in his hand traced dangerous arcs in the air as he approached with each faltering step. You destroyed everything I built. I'll take you with me, he roared, his voice unrecognizable, hoarse and distorted like his body. If I can't have the Sinclair Empire, no one will. Everett felt Camille's protective grip tighten, but surprisingly he felt no fear, only a strange calm born from the certainty that this time he was not alone against the monster. The police officers tried to maneuver for a safe shooting angle, but Sterling was dangerously close now, the flaming wood raised to strike. It was at this crucial moment that an unexpected figure stepped onto the scene. Miriam, the housekeeper who had long remained silent in the face of Sterling's atrocities, bravely interposed herself between the aggressor and his intended victims. Her frail elderly figure, normally hunched from decades of servitude, now stood with surprising dignity. "Enough, you won't touch this boy again," she declared, her voice carrying the moral authority of one who finally chooses the right side of history. "For Lillian, for everything you destroyed, this ends now." Sterling hesitated for just a second, perhaps surprised by the audacity of the housekeeper he had always considered insignificant. That brief moment of confusion quickly turned to renewed fury. With an animal roar, he violently shoved Miriam, causing the elderly woman to fall. But that precious second of distraction was all Prescott needed. The deputy, moving with the calculated precision of years of police training, emerged from the flank, striking Sterling with a blunt blow to the base of his neck. The man fell heavily, the burning wood rolling harmlessly away. Even downed, he continued to shout incoherent threats, trying to drag himself toward Everett. Several officers finally converged on him, completely immobilizing him and handcuffing his scorched wrists. Prescott grabbed him by his partially burned hair, forcing him to look directly at Everett. "Take a good look at this boy, the last sight of your freedom." Because now you're going to know a cage far worse than the one where you kept this innocent child. A month later, the central courthouse of the city was packed to capacity. Journalists, curiosity seekers, and prominent figures from society crowded together to witness the outcome of the case that had dominated headlines for weeks. Sterling Sinclair, now partially recovered, but with permanent scars distorting his once elegant face, remained standing in the defendant's box. Handcuffed and wearing the grey inmate uniform, he kept his eyes fixed on Everett, who was seated between Camille and the lawyer Monroe in the front row. The boy held that gaze unwavering, his upright posture communicating an inner strength that impressed everyone around him. The judge, an austere grey-haired man, adjusted his glasses before reading the final sentence. Sterling Sinclair for the crimes of unlawful imprisonment, psychological torture, attempted homicide, fraud, document forgery, environmental crimes and conspiracy. This court sentences you to 50 years in prison without the possibility of parole. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Sterling was led away. His last look at Everett no longer conveyed a threat, only the belated, bitter understanding of his complete defeat. The boy showed no joy or vengeance, only a serene relief as he leaned back slightly against Camille's shoulder. It was over finally. At the maximum security penitentiary, Sterling walked down the narrow corridor between cells, escorted by 2 burly guards. The other prisoners, already aware of his crimes against a child through the incessant news coverage, reacted with visible hostility. Whistles, insults, murmured promises of retribution followed his progress down the corridor. The irony was not lost on Sterling. He who had considered everyone beneath his social standing was now the most reviled among the reviled. Finally, the guards stopped in front of a cell at the back of Block D. The steel door slid open with a deafening metallic clang. One of the guards shoved him inside, a barely concealed smirk of satisfaction on his face. "Welcome to your new cage, Sinclair. Hope you enjoy being behind bars as much as you enjoyed putting others there." The door slammed shut with finality. Sterling gripped the bars of his cell, the reality of his confinement finally hitting him fully. In the distance, the sound of all the prison doors closing for the night count echoed through the corridors like a metallic symphony of justice. On that same day, miles away, an entirely different scene unfolded. A bright, welcoming seaside home, windows open to the ocean breeze, white curtains swaying gently. Everett ran along the beach, his bare feet leaving prints in the golden sand, laughing openly for the first time in months. Camille watched him from the porch alongside Miriam, who now lived with them as part of the family. The lawyer Monroe approached, holding official documents. "It's done. The adoption is finalized. He's officially your son now, Camille." On the main wall of the living room, a large portrait of Lillian smiled serenely over them all like a silent guardian. Everett paused his running, gazing at the horizon where a blue butterfly hovered over the waves. His fingers touched the locket that now held only a photo of his mother. "Thank you, Mum. You always knew I'd find my way home." Camille approached, enveloping him in a protective embrace. On the living room TV, a news report showed the former Sinclair mansion being transformed. Where there was once pain, there will now be hope. The Lillian Sinclair Center will open its doors next month, funded by the fortune Sterling Sinclair tried to steal, and now serving to protect other children. Hand in hand, Everett and Camille walked towards the sunset on the beach, their silhouettes merging into one against the golden horizon. Miriam watched with a serene smile, finally at peace with her choices. The cycle of pain had been broken, and a new beginning was now possible, not just for Everett, but for all the children who would find refuge where there had once been only shadows. Did you enjoy Everett and Lillian's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like and check out the next one waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.